Hi, everybody. Good evening. Happy New Year. Great to see the crowd here that we have, which is fantastic. I just want to welcome you to the our January meeting 2021 for the Clare Root Society. We're delighted to see everyone here, to have the good crowd here. We are going to be listening to Eamon Healy, who will be talking about the Gort Workhouse. I just want to talk about a couple of things quickly before we get started. Here, the meeting is being recorded. We are going to mute everybody so that Eamon can speak. It will be about 40 minutes to an hour of a lecture, and then we will have questions and answers, which will be moderated. We would ask at the bottom of your screen here, you'll see that there's a little chat icon. If you'll put your questions in that chat icon, and one of us at the end of the presentation will go through those questions and Eamon will answer them. So I'm going to I just want to do a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. We have one of our longstanding members passed away there in the last week. Many of you would know Tony Cassidy. And for those of you that don't know him, I just want to tell you a little bit about Tony. Tony was a lovely, lovely man who attended many, many meetings. I'd say he didn't miss a meeting. Very enthusiastic member from day one when the Clare Root Society was formed. And Tony was a quantity surveyor living for many years over in England, retired to Kilmaley, and just took a great interest in genealogy and family history, amongst other things, or as well as other things. One of those was the post office. And in 1989, Tony co-authored with John Mackey a booklet entitled Introduction to the Post Offices of County Clare. Now, I happened to check this evening, and you can get a used copy of that on Ave Books, but you cannot get that on Amazon. And I don't think that Clare Root Society have any copies of that. But it is if anybody is interested in post office history in County Clare, it is the book to start with. So it might be something that's in the Clare Library. He was also noted for a very fine postcard collection that he had. And he also wrote the book that he's probably more well known for because it's more recent, From a Rock to a Hard Place. It's the story of the Pan Am crash in April of 1948 that took a number of lives. There is a monument in the Calvary section of Drumcliff Cemetery that commemorates the lives of those people that were lost. And he authored that book. And that was 20 years of research. He started his research in 1993, and that book was published in 2013. And it was very, very poignant for many of the descendants of those people who were killed in the crash. And as Tony noted when he finished the book, that he put his mind at rest. It was a culmination of all the work that he had done. And he was actually featured on the RTE History Show. The date of that program is the 21st of April, 2013, and that is still available to view if you go into the RTE, the podcasts. Anyway, he will be very sadly missed, and our sympathies to his wife, Mary, and his daughter, Claire, and his son-in-law, Michael, and grandchildren on his passing. And the other person that I just wanted to mention, who's he's a member of Clare Root Society and attends many of the meetings, Ger Griffey, Ger and his wife Maura. Their daughter Evelyn Nigrifa passed away untimely, a very sad passing there about 10 days ago. And she leaves behind her parents and her two sisters and their families and her husband and a young daughter. So I'd just like to, on behalf of Clare Root Society, sympathize with Jerry and Maura on that very sad loss, and with as well as the passing of Tony. So with that, I would like to introduce Eamon Healy. Eamon and I met a number of years ago. We both took a course down in UL on genealogy. And Eamon has gone from strength to strength. He's a pro-genealogist with Ancestry in Dublin, and he's currently a PhD student with Maynooth. His study is the famine period in Gort and Ballyshannon, County Donegal. And he is going to be looking tonight at researching workhouse ancestors during the famine, a case study of the Gort Poor Law Union, County Galway, which covers parts of Galway, South Galway, and North Clare from 1845 to 1851. So he has a website, which he still has, Beagh Roots, and he's very interested, local historian and a genealogist. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to you, Eamon. We will be taking questions and answers at the end of this presentation. You're all muted until Eamon is finished. And if you do have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat box. So we will hand over to you, Eamon, and I let you do the share screen. Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone.
Jane.
Yes. Great.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just see if I can get the screen working here, so bear with me a second.
Okay, and if I can do anything, let me know.
Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay.
Can we get rid of the tiles here? Yeah, I think we can do. Is that okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
That's okay, Larry.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna get tucked in here. So start off here. So firstly, I'd like to thank Jane and Claire Roots for inviting me to come to do the talk. I'm excited to not only present some of my ongoing PhD research, so it's by no means complete, but also touch briefly on the types of sources we can examine from the comfort of our own homes, which, as we're all aware, this weird times that we're in now, it's very important to be able to continue on our local history and genealogy research. So I want to acknowledge before I begin that much of this research in this talk is not just my own, and it builds on some excellent research by others before me, such as Sister Delort Fahy of Gort, who I think is also online there watching the talk now, James Ryan Darcy of Canada, an accumulation of the many well-researched local parish histories in South Galway. So today I'll be looking at some of the many sources that you can examine to learn more about the life your ancestor would have experienced in the workhouse. And as the title of my talk suggests, I'll be using Gort as the case study to illustrate my point. The aim of the talk is to put into context as best we can what workhouse inmates experience using the available sources. At times, as you can imagine, the content of the lecture is going to be quite heavy, and there'll be time to ask any questions, as Jane said at the very end of the talk. I think those of you watching who already know where your ancestors are from will find this talk most useful, because it's not really aimed at those genealogy brick walls situations where it's hoped that workhouse records are the last great hope in answering where exactly John McMahon of Clare is from, because unfortunately, as we'll see, this type of detail doesn't exist, particularly in the Poor Law Union records that survive for counties Clare and Galway, and Gort included. If your ancestor was an inmate, be it a victim or survivor during the famine period, if they sat on the board of guardians, if they were a staff member, a supplier to the workhouse, or in any ways connected to the workhouse, I'm hoping the talk would be useful to you. So as I've said, I focus on talking about records and sources available online. Some of these are going to be on freely accessible websites, while others are available through online paying subscription websites. So as Jane mentioned, I work for Ancestry, so that'll crop up, but I'll also be talking about records available on Find My Past and some other newspaper archive websites as well. So I'm lucky in the fact that the digitalization of this material has made it possible for me to continue my PhD research, and also in my daily capacity as a genealogist. I know from talking to my colleagues in Maynooth that this isn't necessarily the case for everybody doing research right now, so I'm quite grateful for that. So that being said, I'm going to talk quickly to the agenda. So I've kind of broken it down into 3 different sections. So the first section is just going to talk very briefly about the other types of sources that are used typically when you're researching the famine, and a brief overview of the Poor Law Act, which sets up the workhouses and the Poor Law Unions, which we'll be talking about throughout the talk. The second section, then I'm going to delve deeper into 4 specific types of sources that we can look at. And the first one is the minute books. Parliamentary papers is another one. And then we're going to look at newspapers, which is my absolutely favorite type of source to use in both historical and genealogical research. I'll talk briefly as well about the 1851 census statistics, and then I'll finish off, and I think it's quite apt that I focus on talking about two particular individuals that were very much connected with the Gort Workhouse, who were natives of County Clare. So we'll start off with section 1. So you can see here I have a bullet point list on the left-hand part of the slide. The first 4 here, I'm not going to talk about much because I'll be delving into those during the talk. But I just wanted to quickly, briefly outline some of the other types of sources that I just don't have time to talk about in today's talk. I'll start off there with the 5th bullet point. We have the Irish Famine Relief Commission papers. There, a section of that collection has been digitized and is available on ancestry.com. Now, they're fascinating records to give us insight from 1846 onwards of what's going on in the ground in the wider union. And I'll speak to that a bit more during the talk. Another source that I love looking at is the Chief Secretary Outrage papers. Now, unfortunately, they're not available online. They're only available in the National Archives, which is currently closed due to COVID. Then some of these other records, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. You have the estate papers of particular landlords in various parts of the union. The landed estate court rentals are they become very, very important, we'll say, when the transfer of land starts to transition towards the tail end of the famine period, to see what landlords were bankrupted and who's coming in and what happens as a result in the wider community. The valuation books were the precursor to the printed Griffith's primary valuation. They're available for free on National Archives website. Then you have to have the church records in here of all denominations, not just the Catholic, because quite often we can see, even in the vestry minutes, for example, of Church of Ireland records, we can see, particularly pre-1838, you can kind of get an understanding of what types of relief is going on in the wider community before the 1838 Act creates a national system of poor relief. Burial registers are typically not very common amongst Roman Catholic parishes. I've seen a lot more for the east of the country than I have for the west. But they do exist, and they're very rare, but they do exist. And some of those do cover the famine period. And again, you can get an understanding of what's going on and understand what's going on in the wider community. And the next bullet point then is contemporary travel accounts. One of my favorite websites to mine for this type of information is archive.org, where basically out of copyright books have been digitized and are available online. We have one example for Gort, for example, an American travel writer, Miss Nicholson. She passed through the town and she gives some harrowing descriptions of what happens or what she sees. For Gort in particular, I found the Ordnance Survey name books quite useful to give us a bit more information of landholding practices pre-famine. So it dates around the late 1830s. It's quite useful to understand, the size of farms, what types of agriculture is going on in different areas, the landlords, and other small bits of information. So they're well worth looking up for County Clare. I'm sure there's an equivalent. You have petty session court records. Now, unfortunately, in Gort, they don't survive until after 1851, so they're not useful to my particular research. And I think I could be corrected on this by somebody. I think Newmarket and Fergus is the only one that survives for County Clare that covers the famine period itself. But we can supplement that with looking at prison registers, because quite often they do survive for the famine period and they detail where people have been sentenced from. So for example, you can find a number of people from the Gort petty sessions that end up in Galway jail, and you get an understanding of what types of outrages that they've been arrested for. So that's the left-hand portion of the slide. On the right-hand side, I've just took a screenshot of the first page of a weekly minute book. This particular meeting is from the 19th of February, 1848. And it seems to be very focused on statistics, and the minute books themselves are primarily focused on statistics. There's not much personal information in there. But that being said, we can still get an understanding of what's going on a weekly basis within the workhouse itself. So if we take the first half of the page, it's quite hard to see. Apologies. I'm not sure if everybody can see that last line of that first box remaining on the above date. If you scroll over to the very last box in that column, you can see the number 1035. So that number represents the total amount of inmates in the workhouse the weekend is the 19th of February 1848. If you take another look up to the right-hand box, it's still in the second half of the page, you can see that there's 232 people in the fever wards within the workhouse. So almost 20% of the workhouse population has fever in this particular week. So again, you're dealing with large numbers, and it's somewhat impersonal talking about that, but it's important to understand what's going on in the workhouse. And unfortunately, this is the only source that we have to understand that. The bottom box then is relating to out relief. So these are people that are being relieved outside of the workhouse. And if you scroll down to the very last line, the whole way to the right, you can see 7,812 people are receiving outdoor relief, again, in that particular week. So when you add those two numbers together, there's almost 9,000 people in Gort Union that are getting relieved in some form or another from the workhouse itself. So to put that in perspective, there's 43,500 people within the workhouse area. So a quarter of those are getting relief in this particular week, which again, the numbers are staggering. So to talk about the background, in 1838, the Poor Law Act created a system of poor relief in Ireland, and subsequently the country was divided into poor law unions, which were geographical areas where the poor people would receive poor relief. The union was typically named after the town on which it was centred, and initially the country was divided into 130 different unions, which was later increased to 163 by 1850. The workhouses themselves were essentially created to provide a place of relief for the poor, sick, elderly, and orphaned across the country. However, they're often seen as the final measure, and numbers initially were low in the workhouse. They were designed to be cold, intimidating, and uninviting. But as poverty, starvation, and disease spread across the country, from 1846 onwards, the workhouses became overcrowded and desperate. Each union was administered by what was called a board of guardians. So it was a body of men. 2/3 of those were elected. The remainder was appointed from the local magistracy. And the local poor rate tax collection financed the system. And the board of guardians themselves were held accountable to the poor law commissioners in Dublin, who were then answerable to their superiors in London. And that changed slightly after 1847. The Irish Poor Law Commissioners in Dublin assumed total responsibility. The Temporary Relief Commission was set up in November 1845, and over a lot of back and forth was set up again in February 1847 under the Temporary Relief Act, which is often called the Soup Kitchen Act. Local relief committees were set up by the Commission in February 1846, and essentially this was set up to supplement the original Poor Law Act and allowed a certain amount of relief outside of the workhouse. The Extension Act in 1847 allowed that outdoor relief. And another famous part of that Extension Act was the quarter-acre clause proposed by William Gregory of Cool Park in Gort, which essentially denied outdoor relief to tenants holding more than a quarter acre of land and turned the Act into a charter for land clearances and evictions. Under distress, the Poor Law Commissioners dissolved a number of Board of Guardians across the country for different reasons, and they installed their own paid officers called Vice Guardians. So by 1849, almost a quarter of all unions in the country were dissolved, and Gort and all of the unions in Clare, except Ennis, were also dissolved. And that's primarily the focus of my PhD topic. I'm looking at the impact the Vice Guardians had when they were installed. So that's the background. Just going to delve into the topics here, into the sources here in section 2. So there's different types of poor law union records. So for example, there is indoor relief registers, then they do name people in townland and give a bit of information about them, but unfortunately none survive for Gort or County Clare as a whole. So we have to rely on the types of records that do survive. So as I said, the Board of Guardians were responsible for the management of the workhouse. They met every week and they recorded their meeting discussions in minute books. So that's primarily what I'm going to talk about here. They do provide, as I mentioned as well, if you remember back to that first slide, they do provide an awful lot of statistical information, and they do deal primarily with the administration and finances of the union. But they can be utilized to learn more about the conditions in the workhouse. There is online access to these, so Find My Past has digitized a number of these poor law union records, including Gort, Kilrush, and Ennis Diamond. I believe they're still in the process of digitizing more. There is transcriptions on the Clare Library website, and the Gort records are also available freely on the County Council Archives website in their entirety, right up until 1921. You do need to be aware of start dates when a union was formed prior to 1850. So for example, if you see the top line of this table here, I have Gort Poor Law Union. It was created in 1850, and it's very important to understand what it was created from. And in this case, it was created from Ennistimon. So prior to 1850, if your ancestors were living in that area, you would have to go back to Ennistimon and look to see if there's anything relevant there. After 1850, we'll be looking at Ballyvaughan records if they survived. As you can see here, they haven't. Kilrush Union minute books are available on the Clare Library website by Kieran Maharku, and a guide to Ennistimon Union also by the North Clare Historical Society is up there as well. And that's fascinating to look at to understand the type of topics that you can look at by looking at the broader picture of what's going on in the workhouse. So you can look at the workhouse staff, punishments, disease in the workhouse, outdoor relief, dietary sheets. There's a multitude of topics that you could spend hours talking about here. So while no indoor relief registers for the Ennistimon workhouse have survived, the minute books are unusually detailed as regards death and disease in the house. So that's important to remember as well. As regards these types of records, it's important to remember that this is a very biased source because it represents the attitudes of the gentry and the administration. The largest gap, unfortunately, in the source is the lack of accounts from the labourer, the tenant farmer, or the workhouse inmate themselves. Those directly affected can only be talked about in terms of what others say about them in the minute books or by the statistics that we have. But if we keep this in mind, we can still get a better understanding of conditions in the workhouse. As I mentioned, little or no personal information about any of the paupers are included in the minute books, apart from rare cases of indiscipline or death. It's a time-consuming exercise to learn more about the workhouse conditions. So for example, in Gort, there's 17 volumes of material that cover the famine period. And I should have noted, when I talk about the famine period, for Gort specifically, I'm talking about 1845 to 1851. In those material, those volumes of material, there's roughly 2,000 pages of material. So it can be a bit of a slog to work through, but again, it's fascinating reading because in the books we can get a glimpse of daily life in the workhouse. And it opened in December 1841. So it was the first workhouse to open in Galway. It accommodated 500 people when it opened, and it was on a 7-acre site in the southeast of Gort town on the Ennis Road side of the town, near where the current day secondary schools are. Gort is the biggest town of the centre of the Union with over 3,000 inhabitants, and covered an area of roughly 170 square miles. And as I mentioned, it had a population of roughly 43,000 people, and those numbers coming from the 1841 census. There was 10 civil parishes that made up the Union. 9 were in Galway and 1 in Clare, and that parish in Clare was Kilkeedy or Tubber. It was run by 18 elected and 6 ex officio guardians for a total of 24. So those ex officio guardians, explain that, are from the larger landlord class, and they were magistrates of the area. As a certain amount of property was necessary to have a vote, those appointed to the board were from the ruling class who had little understanding of the position of the destitute poor. The board regulated, ratified and controlled, subject to approval from the Poor Law Commissioners in both Dublin and London, all aspects of union administration. And as I mentioned, they met every week. Boundary changes occurred from February 1850 onwards. So you can see here on my map on the left, the union itself it covered quite a large area, and I apologize in advance that I couldn't make that any bigger to fit on the slide. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there was 33 more unions created in 1850. So you can see here on the bottom left of the area surrounded in red, that was the portion that was covered by Kilkeedy or Tubber parish, and that was essentially lopped off and added to Currafin, which was created in 1850, and the same with the northern part of the parish, the northern part of the union, that was added to Lochray. So almost all the townlands in Tubber were part of Gort Union until 1850, and after that it became Currafin. So, you know, it's obvious if you're from Tubber, you're researching your Tubber ancestors before that date, you do need to examine the Gort workhouse work records. And to give a quick explanation of the map here, the line in red is the boundary pre-1850, and the black line represents the boundary post-1850, and the yellow line is the county boundary between Galway and Clare. So the next couple of slides are just to give a sense of how much impact the institution would have had on local employment and the social fabric of the wider community itself, as well as the variety of jobs that were in the workhouse. I'm not going to speak to all the individuals named here, but just want to highlight some strong connections to Clare wherever they crop up. The connections are to be expected, especially considering the frequent intermarriage and connections between the border areas in both counties, which still persist to this day. You can see in the elected guardians here, we have Isidore Darcy from Tubber. He actually died during the famine. In the landed ex officio guardians here, we have the butlers of Bunahow and Crusheen. You also have Edward Galway of Doon of Crusheen, who were elected to the Board of Guardians. And then you have the vice guardians as well. There was 3 different vice guardians that had been served from February 1848 onwards. And one of those was a Clare native, Stephen Halloran. I'm just after realizing I made a typo here as well, so apologies for that. Then just to get a flavor of what kind of occupations existed or what kind of employees were in the workhouse. And I'm going to pull out those connections to Clare as well again here. So we had William O'Brien, and I'll speak to him at the end, towards the end of this talk, who was a workhouse master for a 7-month period in 1850. He was a native of Clare. You also had 2 of the 3 union doctors had Clare connections. William Mulville was from Killoan and Clare, and Dennis Hines of Kinvara had actually married the daughter of Captain Butler of Crusheen. I should explain those numbers in parentheses after each occupation are the total number of people that served in that occupation during the famine years. So they would have served at different periods in that period of 1845 to 1851. It's quite a varied amount of different types of jobs that were there, that were existent in the workhouse. You can see there was almost 200 people directly employed in running the workhouse itself. And when you add on that then to the number of Board of Guardians, there's quite a number of people involved directly. But there was also those that were indirectly employed, such as the locals supplying turf for fuel, lime for whitewashing. There was people coming in with manure for workhouse gardens, those employed in building walls around cemeteries or extra workhouse construction, those renting auxiliary workhouses to the union. And there's so many more connections with merchants from further afield, such as Russian Palmer of Galway, who were corn merchants. You had Alexander Thom of Thom's Directories fame in Dublin, and he's mentioned quite frequently in there as well. And Vanatine Mills in Ennis, and as well as the Mangan Mills of Gort and Ennis as well. So you get a kind of a better insight into the social networks involved with the workhouse during that period, as well as the finances involved. So to speak to the conditions of the poor, I've pulled out a few bullet points. I mean, I couldn't speak to all the different topics to the conditions that would have impacted everybody, so I've just limited to the medical reports and to the diet. So on the right there, you can see the diet, and I'll let you read that on your own time. But I'd like to speak to the medical reports. So you can see how things are particularly bad already by 1846. The guardians are letting the patients huddle together, and the patients here being patients from the fever hospital in the workhouse side by side with the other poor. So obviously that's not best practice. I mean, contagious diseases are going to spread, which has a direct impact on the mortality rate in the workhouse. And the union doctor complains that the patients were lying in filth and dirt by February 1847. And he described the house as one mass of disease and infection. And we learned that the children were literally naked or wearing filthy old rags. And that gets worse again by June 1847. Overcrowding really ramps up, and there is 3 in every bed, which again beggars belief. Rain comes in torrents to the fever sheds as they hadn't been tarred properly. So you had patients trying to recover from fever getting drenched. And in December, they had such a lack of clothing that children had to stay in bed to stay warm. So again, a lot of the insight is quite depressing and hard to read, but you can get a good understanding of conditions within the workhouse. And you also get mentions of discipline, the price of food, the number of those who died, and I'll speak to that in just the next slide. So if you remember back to the very first screenshot that I showed, I've actually gone along and compiled each one of those weekly minute, the first page of each weekly minute, and compile those into an Excel spreadsheet to kind of understand the admission, discharges, and death rates for the entire famine period in the workhouse, and allows you to see the broader picture and the peaks and troughs of death and admission and discharge. So the first thing you'll notice by looking at this chart is that 1848 and 1849 were a much worse period in Gort than Black 47. So everybody's heard of Black 47, but actually in Gort, 48 and 49 were the two worst years. To put those in real terms, by December 1850, a total of 4,600 people died within the workhouse and auxiliary buildings. So to put that again back in context, 43,500 people within the union, 4,500 have died. So that's almost 10% of the union population dies within the workhouse building. There's three fluctuations of deaths in the workhouse itself. You have mid-1847, early 1848, and then a longer period between November 1848 to 49. All the periods of death are linked with periods of severe overcrowding, followed by outbreaks of fever and cholera. In all cases, there's a sharp increase in deaths in early winter, followed by a sharp increase of admissions. So the seasonal pattern of inmates is clear. There's a steep rise of admissions each September and midwinter peak, and then a summer decrease as harvest time ensues. So with the prospect of work and harvesting, people were more inclined to leave the workhouse. There was a steady increase of inmates living in the workhouse from just over 180 at the beginning of 1846 to a peak of 3,600 in the first week of July 1850. And then it starts to drop to just under 2,000 at the end of October 1850. So again, the numbers we're dealing with are quite phenomenal. Although the capacity of the workhouse premises increased from 500 in September 47 to 3,400 by July 1850, examinations of the minutes reveal that overcrowding existed from September 1847 and continued for the next 4 years. This impacted directly on the deaths. So every time capacity of the workhouse increased, a spike in deaths had occurred in the previous 4 weeks before capacity was enlarged. And that was common for each of the 10 times capacity was increased between 1847 and 1851. So the assumption then from that, I mean, I know I'm talking and throwing a lot of numbers and figures at you, but the assumption of that particular pattern is that the severe increase in deaths were a direct result of the Guardians' inability to deal with overcrowding and their 4-week delay each period to basically increase the capacity of the workhouse itself. As can be seen in this image, the age classes most affected by the famine can be combined into 3 different categories. So the children under the age of 14, they made 55% of the death. And again, in real terms, that's 2,200 children, and 200 of those are under the age of 2. You had able-bodied men and women making up 40% of the deaths, and that skewed slightly more towards women. And the remainder then is made up by the old and sick. So while those numbers seem somewhat impersonal and don't tell the whole story, they do provide context as to what was happening in the workhouse and who were most affected and the biggest famine victims of the famine itself. So I'll speak to the sources. We'll look at Census of Ireland 1851. So you can see that you can access that online for free through the archive.org website, or you can have a look at the hispop.org website. I'm not a huge fan of the hispop website because it crashes quite frequently. While the original 1851 census doesn't survive, statistics compiled from the original census forms do, and they're a valuable resource, not only understanding the impact of the famine and the social impact it had, but also provide some detail into mortality in workhouses and other government-run institutions like prisons. There's 6 parts to the Census of Ireland 1851 reports, but I'll only talk quickly about part 1 and part 5. For those of you who have a bit more time in your hands, part 3 is also an interesting read as it gives a really detailed report on the accounts of famine throughout Irish history, including the Great Famine itself. So part 1 then is arranged by county, then barony, then parish and townland alphabetically, and gives the ability to drill down to the townland level to see the impact of the famine. So as you can see, I've taken a screenshot here of Bunratty Parish. So Bunratty East Townland at the very top line here, you can see it's a comparison between 1841 and 1851. There's 218 people living in the parish in this townland in 1841, and that falls to 110 in 1851, and a similar reduction in houses in the next 2 columns from 26 houses to 15. So you can see that you can get a really good picture of what's going on in a townland level. And you can also look at the parish level itself. So you can see in this slide that some parishes within the Gort Union felt the hardship of the famine more than others. So decreases in population were registered in each of the 10 civil parishes, ranging from 12% to 53%. Total decrease in Gort Union was about 33%, or 15,000 people, when compared to the population in 1841, and the number of houses fell by a similar amount. So like many parishes in the West, the populations of these communities are just now surpassing pre-famine levels 170 odd years later. Part 5 of the 1851 census report records a total of 4,400 deaths, which includes the pre-famine period. But as you can see, interestingly, it reports on the number of deaths, the causes of deaths. So you can see from the graphic, fever, both typhoid and relapsing, was the biggest killer, followed closely by dysentery. Both were infectious diseases which thrived in severe overcrowding. And when deaths from cholera are considered, which is another contagious infection, 63% of deaths are caused by infectious disease. Although starvation isn't reported the cause of any death for any inmate, famine dropsy contributes to the death of 100 people. And marasmus, which was a disease prevalent in severely malnourished children, killed 17%. So famine dropsy generally occurs in the last stages of starvation and results from extreme hunger. So both were a constant major worry for the Union doctor, and it's significant that nearly 20% of deaths in the Union are caused by the lack of food. Cholera is another thing to call out, and between September 1848 and March 1850, 400 people died of cholera as well in that period. With cholera, inmates became so alarmed that they left the workhouse, carrying the contagion with them to other parts of the Union, which starts a mini cholera epidemic outside the workhouse itself. And we can get reports that in local newspapers. Parliamentary papers is another one I'm going to look at. I realize I'm probably a bit slow on time here, so I'll try and speed up a small bit if I can. The parliamentary papers are available on Google Books, or you can look at them on the HISPOP website, archive.org, and a quick keyword search for British parliamentary publications on archive.org will give you returns of almost 1,800 different parliamentary papers to look at. And one that I've used because I'm currently the student and have access to it is the ProQuest Parliamentary Papers database, which is by far the easiest to search, but the subscription is quite expensive for it. Parliamentary papers themselves refers to the amount of papers that were either produced by or presented to Parliament. And there's a huge variety in what that kind of material is, but it can help reconstruct many aspects of the past, including poverty, welfare, crime, politics, and a multitude of other topics. Committees and commissions of inquiry all produce reports, and there's, as I said, a huge variety of what you can find. A whole series of government investigations into Irish poverty took place before the famine, and it's the best known is the Poor Inquiry Ireland parliamentary papers. They were based on local public hearings and questionnaires and covered a huge amount of topics that had a bearing on poverty. It took 3 years to complete that particular inquiry. Ultimately, this commission concluded that the English workhouse system wasn't suitable to Ireland. The recommendations were ignored, and the English poor law system was extended to Ireland in 1838. You also find significant material on proceedings in Ireland beginning to appear in the Poor Law Commissioner's reports from 1842 onwards, as workhouses are built and opened. These annual reports cover a wide variety of issues connected with the new poor law system. And you can find a lot about the appointment of officers, union accounts, collection of poor rates, employment of paupers, moments of indiscipline, and again, a huge variety of topics. And it allows us to compose a picture of the nature and extent of poverty. Again, you do need to be aware of bias because they are government reports. Just a few quick examples in the next few slides about what we can find in those parliamentary papers. So you can see here, this particular report I've pulled up is one from 1841, and it's to do with the valuation of poor rates. In the second half of the slide, you can see I've pulled out 3 different guardians for the Gort Union. You have James Lahav, Jeremiah Rosengrave and Daniel McNevin. All three were elected guardians, and they talk about the conditions of the tenants in the area, which again is relative to the 1841 period. They talk about the average amount of land held by each person, the amount of valuation. You can see subletting is common. And you can see in the very top quote, their principal food is potatoes, often without milk. So again, it gives us great context of what's going on. During the famine period itself, you can see other examples here. I've got one for Ennisdiamond and Kilrush Workhouse unions, which covers the period March 1850 to 1851. It gives great detail on individual causes of death, age, gender, and admission. So you can see the top line here, Biddy Kelly, she was 30, she died of exhaustion, and she died in a few hours after her admission. So that exists for Ennisdiamond and Kilrush for that year. The next slide here, I have parliamentary papers for relating to evictions in the Kilrush Union, and I'm sure very many of you are familiar with this particular parliamentary paper. It's available at Google Books, and it's also transcribed on the Clare Library website. And as I'm sure many of you watching know, Clare had the highest number of evictions proportionally to population of any county in Ireland towards the latter end of the famine and into the mid-1850s. And this particular report was prepared by Captain Arthur Kennedy, who had been a vice guardian in Kilrush. And it gives some great information here. Again, if you look at the first line, Widow Markham, she had been evicted and she had been a tenant at will, so she had no lease. And you can see the observations column in the far right, her house was thrown down and she's now getting outdoor relief. So that's a direct link to the workhouse as well. So now I'm on to my favorite source, newspapers. Where can you access those? You can get them on Irish Newspaper Archives, British Newspaper Archives, or newspapers.com. So there's a huge variety of websites, but those are the three that I generally use. They're all subscription websites. You do need to be aware of political bias. While I was doing my research, I found out quite quickly that there's no newspaper that served the Gort area directly, so I had to focus on examining Limerick newspapers from Galway and Tuam, as well as national newspapers like the Freeman's Journal. There was surprisingly little reference to Gort and the Clare Journal, considering how close geographically they are to each other. The types of reports during the famine can be broken down into lots of different categories, and I've listed a few here. The description of outrages, which would include murder, objection to poor rates, riots, sheep stealing, robberies, threatening notices posted on landlord houses, etc. Those types of reports peak in 1847 and early 1848 and begin to become less common in the newspapers after that. You have evictions and ejectments. In Gort, it peaked in 1850, and this is primarily directly linked to the encumbered estates, and after those estates were sold, new landlords start to evict those in arrears. You also have descriptions of the potato crop, harvest failures, and terrible weather conditions. These types of reports peak in 1846. There's ones directly relevant to the workhouse. So you have a critique and descriptions of workhouse conditions, job advertisements, notices of increased poor rates. All those types of things are in that bracket. You have employment for the public works and employment for the poor. Sorry, you have employment for the poor and public works. This is another category I've come across, where generally it's notices or praise of certain landlords like Lord Gort, who provided employment for their tenants, and that peaked in 1846. You have presentment sessions, which detail what public works are going on in the area. You have famine relief efforts, which is essentially donation subscription lists of all those who have donated. You have the Gort Ladies Benevolent Society, soup kitchen fundraisers. You also have notices praising the model landlords and their benevolence, or when they've reduced their rents on their estates. And the last one, which is obviously the hardest to read, is the famine destitution. So you get various reports of famine deaths, and that peaks in 1846 and 1847. And it details those that died from starvation and want of food, as well as notices about local landlords and clergy who died from famine-related fever, including Robert Gregory of Cool Park. You also have the famine sicknesses and death census, which you can see here in my next slide. So while researching newspaper articles using keywords, looking for any references to location within Gort Union, I came across what is referred to very morbidly as a death census. Essentially, these are reports from Roman Catholic clergy about conditions in their parishes. The reports are connected with Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association, so they are politically motivated. Reports were published in newspapers sympathetic to O'Connell's cause, including the Freeman's Journal, Dublin Weekly Nation, and Dublin Weekly Register. I haven't seen the reports carried in more conservative newspapers like the Clare Journal. The reports themselves provide heartbreaking information about the plight of people in a variety of areas. And while coverage across the country in these reports is fragmented, I've been able to locate reports for 6 of the 8 Roman Catholic parishes contained within the Gort Union. And this gives a local perspective of what was happening on the ground outside the workhouse for those not receiving relief, particularly up to the first half of Black 47. So I have a small selection of images here to highlight the type of information you can find. The image in the top left is particularly relevant for me as it details what's happening in the parish of Beagh, which is where I'm from. From the accumulation of information in the 6 reports I found, according to the parish priests, who again would know their congregation more intimately than government officials, the report suggests that the total number of deaths from the 1st of October 1845 to the 1st of April 1847 in these parishes was almost 900 people. We can't ever know how accurate these numbers are, but the living conditions described are important to give context as to what was happening in the area. And you can see that there on the right-hand side of the slide. I've pulled out some of the common themes that comes through in all the reports. You have the causes of death. So you can see here from eating bad food like seaweed or nettles, or just the lack of food in its entirety. You see as well references to relief or the lack of public works in the area, and other institutions that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So for example, the Sisters of Charity stationed in Clare and Bridge are mentioned in one of the reports. You can see the emotional impact of the destitution on the priests themselves, and a particularly poignant quote there: "May God bless them, my heart is broken at the scenes about me." And then the last thing that you start to see coming through is the immigration starts to be mentioned a lot. As you can see here, by 1846, there's already 50 or 60 people leaving this particular parish. So that was an interesting, it's morbid, but it was an interesting thing to come across, the census of death returns. So I'll finish up on the last section here. I'm going to look at 2 Clare men in Gort. I'm going to start with William O'Brien, the workhouse master, and then I'm going to talk to Stephen O'Halloran, the vice guardian. So the first reference I came across for William O'Brien was his marriage notice to Marcella Burke Brown of New Grove Cottage, Tulla, which is Jane's country, I believe, in January 1834. Now he was employed as a ratepayer, cess collector, in 1837 and 1838 for the Tulla area. When the Scariff Union opened, William and his wife became the master and matron of the Scariff Workhouse. Unfortunately, Marcella died of famine fever in November 1847, and newspaper reports reporting her death also informed that 4 of their children also died during the famine period. Despite the tragedy, William continued in his job, and he didn't resign until May 1848. And newspapers seem to infer that he resigned because of a dispute with Captain Hart, the poor law inspector stationed in Scariff. Subsequently, the Board of Guardians placed a memorial thanking William for his service, and he replied to this memorial from his residence in Peafield. So that was the first indicator that I got from where was William himself from. So when I did a bit of digging, I was able to uncover that Peafield is close by to modern day Tuna Quarry near Ballygriffy Wood, just outside Ennis. And he's registered as a freeholder there in 1835. So he was in the civil parish of Dysart. I'm assuming he's from there, but I'm not entirely sure. He remarried in 1849 to a niece of General Taylor of Castle Taylor in Ardrahan. And interestingly, there was a Church of Ireland and Roman Catholic priest present at the ceremony. The Taylors were Protestant, so I'm assuming that William was Catholic. By June 1849, he's an inspector of works for Ennis, overseeing work in the Union. And between June 1849 and 1850, he actually applies for the job of Master of Gort Workhouse 3 different times, ultimately successful by June 1850. And he was elected by a majority of 15-7 votes. He didn't last long. He was there for just 7 months, and it was primarily over a dispute over various accounts not tallying. and the Board of Guardians tried to make him responsible for the difference, which amounted to about £60, which was a substantial amount. He disputed it and resigned. The Poor Law Commissioners actually found him innocent of any wrongdoing, but by that stage he had already left. He immigrated to the US after his resignation, and I found him in 1855 in New York City with his family. I didn't invest too much time to understand what happened to him after that, but in 1855 he was working as a bookbinder. Just a bit about his children. His eldest son, William McMahon O'Brien, was a captain in Francis Mar's New York Irish Regiment during the American Civil War. And his other son, Thomas V. O'Brien, was a well-known lawyer in San Francisco and a pioneer of the Pacific Coast in the US. His daughter, Frances Marcella Atty, was an accomplished literary figure here in Ireland, so she didn't emigrate with the family. She stayed behind. So William would have been there for just a short period at the tail end of the worst period in the workhouse, but Stephen O'Halloran certainly was thrown into the deep of it. We know Stephen was born in Ballycuneen, Drumline Parish, just outside modern-day Bunratty. Like William, he too was a cesspayer for several years between 1840 and 1849. He was Catholic and he was a repeal movement supporter, so he supported Daniel O'Connell. This was particularly rare amongst vice guardians. So as part of my studies, I've examined all 120 vice guardians across the country, and he's in the 10% brackets that were Roman Catholic and repeal supporters. So he was somewhat of a rarity. In January 1846, newspaper advertisements for land available for rent suggest he was an agent for John O'Brien of Carnelly, MP for Limerick City. And with a little bit of digging, I was able to determine that he was actually a maternal first cousin of John through his mother, Mary Long of Kilkenny and Waterford. So he was a middle-class Catholic family. He was a product of a middle-class Catholic family. By June 1846, he was the secretary of the Bunratty Relief Committee. He resigned that position after 9 men attacked his house. They beat his servant and fired shots into his house. Now, luckily, he wasn't at home when that happened, but he immediately resigned as the secretary. And this last bullet point is very important, again, to understand the bias of the sources you're examining. So you can see here the cause given for his outrage was, as a member of the local relief committee, he discharged his duty in a fair, straightforward, and impartial manner. And this is coming from the Morning Post, which is quite a conservative newspaper. So if you read in between the lines there, you can see, you might be able to assume that he was somewhat stingy with the relief committee money, which wouldn't have been looked on too well when you're surrounded by starving people looking for food. So that could be one of the reasons his house was attacked. And I mean, we'll never know for sure, but it certainly would have played a part. By 1847, he was a board of guardian for Bunratty in Ennis, and he left Bunratty and settled in Bantry, where he actually began employment under the Poor Law Commission. He was only there for 44 days before he was transferred to Gort. And this was a critical moment in the overcrowding in the workhouse. And although 4 months isn't a very long period of time, if you're surrounded by the destitution, I would imagine that 4 months would seem like 4 years. You have to remember as well that the vice guardians were replacing board of guardians. So there was only 2 that were replacing the jobs of 24, and they were there for the guts of 18 months. So again, it was a lot of work, and it would have been harrowing to experience that. After the famine, he married Jane Cullinan of Ennis. And by the time Griffith's valuation was published, he held 160 acres worth £111. So he was relatively well off. Parliamentary papers, he actually gave testimony in one commission in May 1861. And we learned then from that he had acted as a guardian in some capacity since 1841 in Limerick and also in Ennis. He died in Mealickville in Limerick in March 1863, and he's buried in Drumcliff in Ennis. Like William, his children seem to have done fairly well. His son, Stephen Jr., was a manager of the National Bank in Mullingar, and his son, Michael Cullinan Halloran, was a solicitor, and he had offices in Dublin and Ennis. And that concludes my talk. I do welcome any questions or comments. Apologies again for the breakdown in the technical issues here halfway through the talk. Thanks very much for your patience, and hopefully you've learned something from the talk.
That was excellent. Thanks very much, Eamon. We do have a few questions there. I don't know.
I
Eamon,
actually didn't see any questions during the talk, so I'm just having a quick read of
okay.
them just now.
Okay, yeah. The first question there. Somebody asks about the version of Ancestry that you refer to.
So I'm, I suppose because I work for them, I'm constantly logged in as the .com on the .com of the site. So I am aware that there is different subscription levels, but I couldn't speak to that personally because that's not something that would be in my remit as an employee. That's not my department whatsoever. But it depends when you say what version of Ancestry are you referencing. It depends on what record collections are you talking about specifically. I don't know, maybe that person, Doug, you might actually throw that in the chat there, and I'll get to that as I go through the questions.
Yeah, I'll see there if Doug is still, yeah, Doug is here. I'll unmute you, Doug. You might, if you want to comment on that. Because I think that can cause some confusion.
It can.
Yes.
Doug, yeah.
I'm in Florida in the US. Typically, when we subscribe to Ancestry, it's ancestry.com, but it's the US version. If we start searching for records in UK or Ireland, it's all of a sudden the UK version, which costs more. But that's what I wonder. Are you using UK, US, or worldwide?
So yes, I'm actually using the worldwide subscription, Doug, but I'm not sure if this is relevant for you, but I do know that libraries in the US in particular do provide access to Ancestry online. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think that is the worldwide subscription as well. So that's definitely something worth looking into.
Yeah, because I'm trying to chase, of all families, the O'Brien families in County Clare. Thank you.
No problem. So I see here Eric has a question. 2 auxiliary workhouses in Clare Castle, part of the Ennis Union. Any separate records for Clare Castle? I can't speak to that. I don't know off the top of my head, Eric, but what I do know is that the records for Ennis Union are sporadic. I don't think they covered the entire famine period, but I can speak in Gort, for example, there isn't separate records for the auxiliary workhouses. And that becomes plainly apparent for Kinvara. So Kinvara is a bit of a distance from Gort town. They're both within Gort Union. There was a separate temporary hospital in Kinvara, and no records survive for that. So I'm not sure that there is separate records for the auxiliary workhouses themselves.
Okay, thanks.
I hope that answers your question. No problem.
Somebody,
George.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jane. I'm just
going
okay. Down through them.
If you're going, that's perfect. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So Jared asked for everybody, are there any Clare specific newspapers available online? And the answer to that is yes. I know, for example, Clare Journal is on British Newspaper Archives. I know there's another newspaper that covers the Kilrush area. I think that's on British Newspaper Archives as well. I could be wrong there. I think Paddy's on the call. He might know better to that. But it is worth pointing out as well, like I talked about with Gort in particular, a lot of the newspapers that covered my research were actually Limerick newspapers. So try not to limit yourself to just newspapers that were published in that particular county. Look a little bit broader. So I wouldn't have been able to get half the information unless I had actually expanded that search.
Yeah, thank you, Eamon. Yeah, I've looked at Limerick and some Clare and Galway, but I'm trying to get some more specific information around Kilrush. So that's why I was wondering, was there anything a little bit more specific? But I hadn't tried British Newspaper Archives, so I'll try that one. Thank you.
Yes, you can access that, George, through Find My Past as part of their subscription package. You don't have to get it separate. You should be able to access it through that then.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. In general, this is a question from Liz. In general, is there a general finding aid anywhere that lists newspaper in Ireland for this period by locality? Well, that's a great question. There was a project back in the 90s. I think it was called Newsplan. I'm not sure if they've actually upgraded from the book to website format, but they did catalog survival rates of newspapers around the country. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I'd have to double check that. But News Plan is the name of the book, and that was published in the 80s and 90s. I think there's a website to go with that too.
Do you have any?
I'm actually seeing everybody's thank yous. Thanks very much. I'm getting a very big head reading all these thank yous right now. How extensive are the records for the 1851 census? And a question from Ger. When I talk about the 1851 census in that slide, I was talking specifically to the reports. So they're not. I'm not talking about what you would be used to looking at in the 1901 or 1911 census records. As to how extensive is there fragments that might survive for Clare, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I don't think there is many, if there is any at all. But it's definitely worth checking out the pension application forms as well if you haven't looked at those before. Sometimes what happens is like Paddy had a great example on Facebook yesterday, I think, where you can get great information on the back of a pension application form that will give you some detail as to the families in 1851. But to answer your question, the records aren't extensive. The reports are, but they only give numbers, they don't give names.
Okay. Mary Stanley has a question there, so I'm just going to unmute Mary to ask so she can ask the question. Okay, are you unmuted there, Mary? You are. Perfect. Okay.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Eamon. My question is, I know from going out on the Drumcliff Road to the office, it's a two-storey office that I think is the births, deaths and marriages out from Innis, or it's a government office. And they were able to tell me that someone with the surname that is my family died in the workhouse. But that was all they had. I also know that in the same family, 3 other of their children died they come from around Innis, died prior to my great-great-grandfather dying here in Melbourne in 1891. That they were already deceased before they came to Australia in about 1852. How would I track anything more about the gentleman who died in the workhouse? Because I'm not sure. Now I understand there are several kinds of workhouse records. That Office of Public Records, is that what that
GRO, I think.
Two-storey building would be?
The brick building.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where.
So whatever records would survive, Mary, and again, I off the top of my head, I don't know the specifics of the survival rate for records for Ennis, but I know that Kieran Murharku, who did the Sable Wings over, I have that name, I have that wrong there. Sable Wings Over the Land. His book is primarily based on using newspaper records. So based on that, I would imagine that there isn't actually any great survival of minute books, for example, for the Ennis Union during the famine period. It's definitely worth shooting off an email to Peter Byrne or somebody in the Clare archives to see what does exist. So at one of those slides that I showed, that box of what survives, that's based primarily on a book that was published in 1993. So it's not necessarily up to date. I reached out to Peter to update that with records for Kilrush, because I mean, this will tell you, before this talk, when I was preparing for it, I was under the impression that there was no minute books for Kilrush. And when I did a quick survey, I find all the minute books for Kilrush up on that website. So you really do need to do your bit of digging to see what records do survive. And your county archivist would be the first protocol that I would go to.
So release me from my ignorance in terms of Peter Byrne. He's an archivist with the council or with the county, or what's?
Peter is the senior archivist there at the, I'm just going to put it up here for everybody, because Peter is with the local studies center in Ennis. And you can access, if you go into the Clare Library website, and then go in, search for the local study center, you'll get Peter's email address. If somebody has it there in the Clare Roots offhand, you can put it up on the chat, but he's the person that he'd be able to direct you. And it's not open, but he's working from home, so he would be able, you can send him an email and he'd be able to, direct you further. But you're writing, and there's always new things. Yeah, sorry, Mary.
No worries. There's a time lag across the 17,000 Ks. Peter Burns spells his name B-Y-R-N-E or B-U?
No, I put it, it's B-E-I-R-N-E. Peter Byrne, B-E-I-R-N-E. It's, what is it, at local studies dot something. I don't have it offhand. If somebody has it there, fire it into the chat box.
Into Clare Library site.
Clare, yeah, the Clare Library site will get you to Peter. Yeah, there's
Maria,
Larry.
Marie asked something else. She went on to 1890 about certificates. The certificates are online from 1864, births, marriages and deaths. They're online at Irish Genealogy. I usually do BMD Ireland, and you'll get straight into that site. So you'll be able to download an original certificate. Okay, they're all up online now, freely available. Okay.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Larry. That's brilliant. Yeah.
It's worth bearing in mind as well that I only touched on a really, really small portion of what's there in terms of researching the famine period. There's so much more there. I wish I could keep talking all night, but unfortunately we just don't have the time. But there's some more obscure records that I've only come across that not many people have much knowledge about. And one of those things is there was ladies' societies set up to fundraise to clothe the poor, and they're based in conjunction with the Quakers. So they're not a government source, and you're not going to get the same types of bias. So if you're really seriously looking at the famine period, that's another source I would definitely look at. They're not available online. They're in the National Archives. And I realize as well that not everybody's going to read through the minute books for fun like I've been doing. So another thing I'd like to call out there is to build on other academics' research. And there's a real push right now, and I think, Jane, you can probably speak to that as well, for people to get their thesis and research out there and put stuff up on digital repositories. So there's two websites I'm going to call out here, and I'll put it in the group chat as well. But the first one is rian.ie, so RIAN.ie. And basically what that is, it's an online portal where you can search thesis, master's and PhD papers that people have done. And I did a quick search there last night just to see, and I can see that Father Ignatius Murphy had done a paper back in the 70s or 80s about, and I'm definitely going to murder the pronunciation here, Kilfira parish in Mayarta. I say Paddy will murder me for not pronouncing it right, but I think that's how you pronounce it. He did a talk about, he did his master's about that, and he would have done a lot of the same types of source research that I've talked about. So that's rian.ie. It's worth looking at to see if there's anything up there. And the second one that I would call out then is dart.eu, so DART.eu. And it's the same thing, but it's just European wide. So Irish studies right now, there's a real drive to get people doing that. So have a quick look at those two websites to see, because I am aware that not everybody's going to go through minute books, as I said, when they're bored. So
Eamon, I'd like to come in there, say that Mayarta is pronounced Mayarta, Kilfira is Kilfira.
Okay.
I live within a stone's throw. I'm living in the parish of Mayarta, and I'm not too far from Kilfira.
I should know better because my mother's family have roots in Moveen. So.
All right. What's the name?
Hanrahan.
Oh, could be related to them.
Probably.
Hanrahan. Yeah. Very good. Excellent talk.
Okay.
I just missed a small bit of it because I had to take a phone call. But well done.
Thank you.
That's great. Do we have any more questions? I think we're probably okay for questions there. There's lots of thanks. It was fantastic, Eamon. Really great talk now, and just terrific all the resources that you've given us. I've taken down those 2 websites because there's always something that you don't know about that's out there. Like you said, it's just it's a matter of digging around. But I think it's good the point you made about getting in contact with the archivist, whether it's the local study center in Clare or the Clare County Archives, because they really are helpful. And even though everything is closed, they are working from home behind the scenes. I know Peter Byrne is, and he is contactable, and he's excellent for assistance and knowing off the top of his head a resource that none of us might have heard of that he is he knows about. Peter.Byrne, BEIRNE at clarelibrary.ie is his email address. Now, before we go, I just want to let you know that we have Joe Power, Dr. Joe Power, coming to speak on Zoom next month. That's the 18th of February. And he will be talking about the Clare and the War of Independence. He has recently published a book, and he will be discussing some of the material from that book for us. That is actually available at the moment in local bookshops. Probably you'd have to email them to try and get a copy of that. But he will be, he's spoken here on other occasions at Clare Root Society. He's a very well-known local historian, and he will be speaking at Thursday, the 18th of February at 8 o'clock. And again, it's a Zoom meeting. We'll be sending on the link there closer to the time. And then on the 18th of March, we have Cathal Crowe, TD, but also a local historian who will be speaking to us on some Clon Lara genealogy and local history as well. And we'll have further details as time, in the future about that. So if there's no other questions, there's lots of thanks, Eamon, and Patty has just noted here that Ignatius Murphy has several publications before the famine struck: Life in West Clare, 1834 to 45, and A People Starved, Life and Death in West Clare. I would think that the local studies center would have access to those books, and then the well-known the 3-volume book where he does discuss the famine to a certain extent there in the Diocese of Killaloe. So so thanks for that, Patty. That's great. And lots of thanks, Eamon. We really appreciated that. Great information there. And somebody's asking, will we put the sites in the chat? Yes, we'll try and do that. Or maybe what we can do is send it in an email. Somebody's just put in Thank you, Aileen. Thank you, Aileen. Aileen's on the ball this evening. Thanks a lot. That's great. You need a couple of people to do these meetings. You can't do them on you have to, you need a couple of co-hosts. But anyway, so with that, thanks very much, everyone, for visiting and for coming along this evening. We had a great crowd, our biggest crowd yet, Eamon. So you've topped the polls here, which is great. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us via the website clareroots.org, or our Facebook page, or our Twitter account at Clare Rooter. And we hope to see you all next month, 18th of February, Thursday night at 8 o'clock. A million thanks, Eamon. Great talk again, and the best of luck with the PhD. And everybody stay safe and well, and we'll see you hopefully next month. Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you. Good night.